This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, we are joined by presidential historian and prolific Reagan biographer Craig Shirley. Craig Shirley is the author of the new book, April 1945, The Hinge of History, which tells the story of the American victory at the end of the Second World War.
Craig Shirley, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you very much.
Well, it's great to have you back on the show. You may recall you were our first guest when we kicked off Reaganism.
I remember that.
Yeah, over 100 episodes ago. So we've continued at it, and and you have as well. Congratulations on your newest book, April 1945, The Hinge of History. You can get this on Amazon. You're known to the world of Reaganism for your biographies on Ronald Reagan, but you've also done other works and a historian looking at a variety of personalities and moments in history. The April 1945 book is like a companion, perhaps a bookend to the 1941 book. Tell us about that.
Well, I decided to write that, December 1941. It really goes back to my childhood, Roger, and you probably had the same childhood. I remember every Sunday after church, we would go over to my grandfather's house, and we'd have a big Sunday dinner, turkey or roast beef or something like that, goose or something. And I remember sitting around the table. I was just a little guy, and I'd have aunts and uncles and grandparents and parents. And invariably, the conversation always turned to the war. As in, my grandfather would say, well, I bought that Hudson before the war, but I didn't sell it till after the war. And then they would talk about, making, getting oleo butter and mixing up the chem dye in it to make it look more palatable yellow than the sickly white it looked like that you got, because all the butter was being sent to American servicemen, British soldiers, and Soviet soldiers. And they talk about rations, and they talk about gas stamps. And both my grandmothers were Rosie the Riveters. One was a machine gun inspector. She used to stand there as a machine gun came down the conveyor belt, pick it up, fire it, rat-tat-tat-tat-tat, and then set it down, and the next one would come down the conveyor belt, she'd pick it up, fire it. My other grandmother was a bomb inspector, which I never got a chance to really ask her what a bomb inspector did. I hope it wasn't too dangerous. My mother, one time I said to her that I thought victory gardens, this was years ago, were kind of a PR ploy by the Roosevelt administration, and she got indignant. She said, I had a victory garden in our backyard. She was just a little kid. She was born in 1932, so she was, 11 years old to be at the beginning of the war. But she had a victory garden. All of her neighbors had victory gardens. And then I did a little research and found out there were victory gardens all across America, on tenements, on top of tenements, in small family farms, in American backyards. And as a matter of fact, in 1944, something like 1/4 of all vegetables grown in America were grown in victory gardens.
So this is all from your childhood. You're absorbing this and you're thinking back. Yes. And so that's how you got to December, your first book of this, which now I guess a series, December 1941.
Which was the entry into the war. So then I started doing some more research, and I found out all the things that happened in April 1945. FDR dies. Hitler commits suicide. Mussolini's taken down by the mob. Auschwitz is discovered. Buchenwald is discovered, and along with their horrors. The Okinawa is raging as a final staging island for the final invasion of the mainland of Japan, MacArthur's forces. And there's just every day is a red letter day. Every day is a big block letter newspaper day. So hence April 1945.
But the perspective in which you approach this for the April 1945 book, which you call The Hinge of History, right? This is almost you have the war from 1941 till 1945, but
right.
This month is really seminal. You're giving it from the perspective of the American people almost experiencing the war. Tell us about that. As I'm reading through this book, Craig, it's like, okay, if I'm opening up the newspaper over the course of January 1945 or March 1945, here's the variety of things you're going to read about, from the European theater to the Pacific theater to what's going on socially, whether it's in DC, New York, or another metropolis.
I went through FDR's library material, Truman's library material, Eisenhower's library material, the Library of Congress material, books like, for instance, Patton's diary. David Brinkley wrote a wonderful book, which I used as a source too, called Washington Goes to War. And that was also used as a source material. I used about 300 books as source material, and a number of magazines and newspapers, Life magazine, Look magazine, Saturday Evening Post, Harper's Bazaar. And so that's how I was able to really construct the story, just everything going together. And I wanted to do it, let me just say this one thing, Roger, is that most historians write from 30,000 feet. And they write in an academic sense and let us now examine the conditions under which propelled the United States into the conflict in Europe. I don't write like that. I'm write at a very ground level. I try to write and put through the eyes and ears of people as they were going through April of 1945. I try to make it as gritty and real as possible.
I think that definitely comes across, Craig. And tell us more about the mindset of that average American in February, March, or April 1945. I mean, here's a couple maybe you want to hit on, right? They're seeing Patton's armies, Third Army, advance through Europe. In the book, you really kind of give the feeling that they don't quite know how much momentum they're realizing, but they seem to be advancing. You have enemies, both Germany, and Japan as well, that comes out, that are just not giving up. They're entrenched. Yes. And you have this emergence of some sort of post-war conversation, right? So at the same time that we have servicemen fighting, the statesmen of the day, and you focus rightfully on FDR, they're getting ready for Yalta, and they're trying to figure out what the post-war construct is. Did I get that right? And tell me more kind of about what the experience was for the American living through all this in those critical months and ultimately in April 1945.
It is, there's only two times in the history, the 250-year history of America, where we have been completely unified. Was during World War II, and in a couple of weeks and months after September 11th. We've never been unified as a country. We were unified in the American Revolution. We certainly weren't unified in the Civil War. That was about our very divisions. Is that 30-some members of Congress, 37 members of Congress voted against our entry into World War II or World War I. We were obviously divided over the Vietnam War. We were divided over the Civil Rights Movement. We were divided over so many issues. We've always been divided. It is the only time we were united was during World War II, and that quickly ended after the war, and then after the afternoon and the weeks after September 11th, and that unity dissipated as well. I guess maybe the strength of the United States is our ability to compromise between two different positions, the Missouri Compromise or whatever else.
I want to get to FDR as a figure who was able to either drive that unity or leverage the unity to advance some war goals. But before we do, the piece that kind of got my attention, certainly the earlier part of this book, April 1945, The Hinge of History, is the recognition that we were seeking unconditional surrender.
Yes.
And that had to have been in hindsight, that's almost something, well, I know I do think of it as a matter of course, but really in your book, it seems to be something that perhaps wasn't taken as a matter of course and really required deft political work on the part of FDR. No doubt the Nazis and the Japanese did a lot to convince the Americans that unconditional surrender would be the only way to get out of the conflict. But talk about unconditional surrender as kind of a thread in this story of American unity that you've just shared.
There was a debate, Roger, in early 1945. We knew we were winning the war. We knew the war was coming to a successful conclusion. The question now was that do we prosecute the war and into Berlin and utterly destroy Germany, Adolf Hitler, Goebbels, the German, the Nazi infrastructure, everything, or do we go for a negotiated surrender? There was some debate, but FDR was insistent on unconditional surrender. Winston Churchill was insistent on unconditional surrender, and so was Stalin. It was one of the few times the big three actually agreed on something. And the American people seem to tilt toward, look, we've won 4 years of war now, so let's just go for unconditional surrender instead of negotiated surrender. Unconditional, we just wanted to obliterate them, defeat them. And why not? After how the Nazis had behaved, and after the things they did, the 20 million people died at the hands of the Nazis.
I mean, and that's part of the story, Craig, as this very important political consideration is being debated. And you mentioned that the big three, Churchill, Stalin, of course, FDR, agreed that the objective here was unconditional surrender. As we're moving through Europe, we're seeing the atrocities of the Nazis. And you write about that. You write about how Americans were discovering, GIs were discovering, and then the news was coming back to the United States about genocide against the Jews and the Holocaust and just the brutality of the Nazi regime. Tell us about how the American, in the Midwest experienced that news and how it impacted their view politically of outcomes.
It's a complicated question because the Washington Post and the New York Times reported on the death camps, but they didn't report initially it was Jews were being killed systematically by Nazi Germany. They just simply reported that people were dying in these death camps. Is that almost like they either want to cover it up, or they're embarrassed, or they didn't identify them, the victims racially. Whatever reason, they both newspapers did not, but other news organizations did. Time magazine did, not Newsweek, but Time magazine, Life did report that it was Jews who were being killed, and that it was 6 million Jews who had died at the hands of Nazi Germany. I think most people were in disbelief. Hitler once said, the bigger the lie, the more you get away with it. It was so big. It was so massive. It was so just couldn't believe that they would systematically kill, 10 million people, 6 million Jews, and then another 4 million, handicapped, homosexuals, alcoholics, Polish workers, Russian workers. They would kill so many people.
And of course, this is all coming in this period of time. I mean, you had perhaps, little bits of reporting in the year prior or years prior, but it was my sense of your book, 1945 is when the world and Americans really came to internalize and realize what had transpired. And the U.S. military, of course, the reason why was actually marching through Germany and seeing these camps, and the general officers would make, as you write, the locals, the local communities, to see what was happening, near their homes.
Yes, they knew it. The German people knew it. The Manhattan Institute did report as early as 1941 on the systematic disappearance of Jews from Germany. how they were just, doctors and dentists and other professionals were disappearing from Berlin and Nuremberg and from other German cities, and how they were just disappearing in the dark of the night. You can't tell me that the neighbors, didn't wake up in the morning and notice that, the neighbors, their Jewish next door neighbor was gone. Was gone in the middle of the night. The German people knew. The German people knew all about it. They knew what was going on. You cannot exterminate 6 million people, or load them into boxcars and set boxcars on fire, or load them into houses and set houses on fire, or have these awful. And by the way, too, before I got into this, Roger, I knew about Buchenwald, I knew about Auschwitz, I knew about Treblinka, I knew about Dachau, I knew about the major Nazi death camps. But I didn't realize that the Nazis, until I got into the research, the Nazis had dozens of death camps all over Europe, dozens of death camps over Poland, over all the Hungary, all these countries. There's probably 2 or 3, 4 dozen different death camps. We only know about the major ones.
Right. And so this is, again, part of the story of 1945. But of course, what drives you to April 1945 is the death of the two arguably biggest players in World War II, out of Hitler, and before that, FDR. Craig, in your mind, what was the more significant death in terms of the end of the war? Was it?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It was FDR's because of his importance on the world stage. He was, in essence, during World War II, FDR was president of the world, not just of the United States. Is that he was conducting a 2-front war. He was supplying the British. He was supplying the Soviets. He was supplying all the allies. Were being supplied, in addition to the American soldier himself, were being supplied by the United States government, and we had a far-flung war extending thousands of miles all over the globe. And when he died, flags in Moscow were at half mast, were at half staff. His death was broadcast over the radio for 3 or 4 days, constantly. Just constant broadcasting of the movement of his death, from the time he was loaded on the Ferdinand Magellan train in the little White House in Hot Springs, Georgia, up to his burial in Hyde Park, and his lying in state in the White House. It was covered continuously. My mother was like many children. When he died, she thought that America only had 3 presidents. We had George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. She'd only known one president from the time that she was born up until 1945, when she was 14 years old, and it was Franklin Roosevelt.
Well, I encourage our watchers and listeners to read this book, and particularly Craig, the way you capture the reaction to FDR's death. You just give wonderful, sweeping treatment of how the world responded. In fact, you have this great line: the phrase, quote, "world leader" should have been invented for Franklin Roosevelt. And then relevant, of course, to the Reagan Institute and more broadly our foundation, it's in this moment where you reference how a young Ronald Reagan, 21, had just graduated from Eureka College, and he was the enthusiastic FDR Democrat.
He voted for him 4 times. And it was his favorite phrase, "rendezvous with destiny," was from FDR's 1936 convention speech.
Which someone here wrote a book about, huh?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, it is remarkable when you think about FDR's career. I mean, he was president for 4,423 days. Just a shocking amount of time. Even the healthiest, most fit young person in peaceful times could probably not withstand the strains of the office. No. And of course, he came in, as you noted, as doctor of the economy, coming in with a New Deal and trying to rescue the United States out of the Depression. And of course has to pivot and build up the military and really has a vision. It's interesting. You capture this in your April 1945 book, but to capture the significance of his death, you go back to what he was doing in 1939 and 1940 and 1941, particularly the arsenal of democracy and what a huge undertaking that was. Give us a little more color on that.
On FDR himself?
And what he had to do to get the country ready for the war, right? And the strain involved.
Yeah, we were not ready for war. We had, in the 1930s, a Democratic Congress and FDR passed various neutrality acts and were signed into law by Franklin Roosevelt, including one law which prohibited U.S. troops from leaving North America. And those all had to be undone after December 7th, 1941. The Congress had to vote to undo the neutrality acts so that we could legally get into the Pacific War and then the European War several days later. So the way, I guess, one of the ways was his morale speeches. He gave lots of speeches. He gave lots of fireside talks. He did a lot of things to set an example. He had blackout curtains in the White House. The White House became like an armed camp. There were machine gun nests on top of the Lincoln Memorial. Is that we were ready for war. Washington was ready for war, and by like token, America was getting ready for war. We did the same thing in Boston and New York. We had air raid shelters. We had, air raid sirens and bombing warnings and blackouts and brownouts and rationing. And America's it's interesting because my uncle was killed in World War II. And that was but he was one of 600,000 U.S. servicemen who died in World War II. Is that, many people sacrificed without making the ultimate sacrifice. There were rubber drives, there were scrap drives, there were metal drives. They rationed gasoline, they rationed meat, they rationed milk, they rationed butter. Everybody did something. Everybody did their part for what they called the war effort. It used to be a sarcastic saying to each other, "Hey, there's a war on," So drives. I found out too, the national speed limit was 35 miles an hour. Can you imagine driving around Washington or Los Angeles?
The fuel shortages, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe when you get, we get to $5 a gallon, maybe it'll happen here too.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. But you imagine driving around the wilds of Montana at 35 miles an hour. It'd take you weeks to get from one side of the state to the other.
It's just remarkable. I mean, as looking at this, the lens of 2022, and obviously there's the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion, yes. and we're thinking about how the country responds. And of course, it's not analogous, obviously, to Pearl Harbor, but there's kind of rhyming with the Cold War. But the broader point is how the country gets its mindset, and it can just shift on a dime. And
sure.
You have FDR, the New Dealer, now calling for at once a 2-ocean navy and 50,000 airplanes. It's the constructs of today don't have to be the limitations or the constructs of tomorrow, and that really just kind of plays through in your treatment of FDR.
It does, doesn't it?
Craig, two generals make appearances throughout this pivotal time in 1945. You have Patton and you have MacArthur,
yes.
And you're
two great generals.
And it's almost the way that you kind of weave the story together as Americans have their eyes on what's going on in Europe, and then also in the Pacific. Families have children in both theaters. Both are great and difficult challenges. They hadn't been keeping pace. Of course, it was really Europe first, the continent first. But at this point in 1945, it's full bore on both fronts. Give us a little more about Patton and MacArthur. And my sense is from the book and the way you write and the sources you're using, they were really the generals that the American people were reading about and talking about and almost measuring the war through their reporting of their exploits.
They're probably two of the most colorful generals and two of the most successful generals. What Patton did with the Third Army, the Germans always thought that Patton was the best general we had and that he would become the supreme commander, not Eisenhower. So they always feared him the most. And of course, what he did with his Third Army is that he never gave up ground. It was always on offense, never on defense, never holding the same territory, never fighting for the same territory twice. Is that he marched steadily from when his army came ashore in Normandy. He marched steadily, gaining 10, 15, 20 miles a day toward Berlin, never retreating, never backing up, never slowing down. And of course, it was a brilliant offensive maneuver against the Germans' last offense at Bastogne, the Battle of the Bulge, and how he beat that Battle of the Bulge back and destroyed the Germans' last offensive battle before the final collapse of Berlin and Adolf Hitler. And of course, MacArthur, let me just say one thing about MacArthur. I think MacArthur is probably my favorite general. What he did in island hopping up the Asiatic Peninsula was brilliant. Not going after their hard spots, but going after their soft spots. And then his stewardship and what he did to rebuild Japan, he should have won the Nobel Peace Prize. He didn't, and we know why, because Nobel Peace Prizes only go to leftists. But what he did to rebuild it into a peaceful, democratic, free market society, to rebuild what was essentially a destroyed country, was not only kind, but it was also brilliant.
No doubt. The lasting and great achievement of the post-World War II construct, he deserves lots of credit for. And of course, the world benefits from it today. Here we are, 2022, 75 plus years later. The epilogue, the end of your book, Craig, we have Truman as president.
Right. And
you write about him throughout the book, a vice president who was not in the center of decision-making by any stretch under FDR.
No.
Someone clearly, as others have written, familiar with Washington, the social scene, as you capture some of that as well.
Right.
But then comes in and sees it for himself and makes these huge decisions in terms of how atomic bomb in Japan, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and then of course also coming to a real sense of who Stalin was and was not. And you have this great quote
at Yalta. Yes.
At Yalta. And this great quote.
Potsdam, I mean.
The Potsdam conference, and then and concludes after meeting with Stalin that he's cured him of any thought that he could work with the Russians. Talk about Truman and this last part of 1945, because as much as it was about FDR's death, the birth of Truman, the statesman, perhaps is equally significant, Craig.
Yeah, he was just a hack politician out of Missouri who was elected with under suspicious circumstances by the Pendergast machine there, the Pendergast political machine. He was not. He was thought of as kind of a lightweight until he headed the war commission investigating corruption and crime in the War Department contracting. And he gained some stature with that, gained some notoriety. And in 1944, when he went on the ticket, FDR had to get rid of Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace had become an embarrassment, and he was way too left wing. And he needed somebody who would balance the ticket. And Truman, it was thought of at the time, was slightly more conservative than FDR, so he would balance the ticket. And so, of course, won. But he was completely in the dark. He was never had never had any private meetings with FDR, was never consulted, was never an advisor. Today, vice presidents are routinely used for their advice by the president. And really, that's probably started with Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale, and then continued with Reagan and Bush and so forth. But prior Woodrow Wilson's vice president, Thomas Evans, had to wait 2 years to get an appointment, a private appointment with
they
Wilson.
spend all their time in the Senate. I mean, that's what you write. Truman was in the Senate when he found out FDR passed away.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. He was a poker player. He was a drinker. He liked, hobnobbing with the boys and with lobbyists and things like that. But he was not considered to be a great world statesman. I would, if you ask my estimation, I would say that our four greatest presidents are George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, and Ronald Reagan, because they freed or saved many, many people. But Truman would be right in the second tier of somewhat almost great presidents. He would be there with, like, for instance, I don't know, maybe Eisenhower, maybe Teddy Roosevelt,
Well, certainly in terms of where your book ends, recognition of what the Stalin-Soviet threat was.
Right.
Certainly Churchill was someone who continued to hope that there could be reconciliation in a way that Truman was quite clear. We had a new problem.
Iron Curtain.
And that it took Churchill a little bit of time. And so Truman came around, was very clear. And then decision what was required to end the war.
Yes.
With Hiroshima and Nagasaki,
so.
And those are consequential moments. I mean,
I always thought Truman never regretted his decisions to drop the bomb, but I wish he had at least given Tojo a chance and dropped the first bomb in Tokyo Bay, so he could see the awesome power of the atomic bomb and give him a chance to possibly surrender with less loss of civilian life than happened because of Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
Before we leave April 1945, the hinge of history, you obviously growing up around veterans of the Second World War, you were reflecting about time with your grandparents and people sharing their experiences. What was something you learned by going through all these sources, the secondary sources, the primary sources, trying to experience this as an American was experiencing the world in April of 1945 and the months prior? What kind of stood out to you as something that you didn't appreciate going into the book, but now you kind of see it in a new way?
Oh, how altruistic America can be. And we were during World War II. We were. There was a clear cut. We were the good guys. They were the bad guys. There was no moral ambiguity. Like in Vietnam, there was moral ambiguity. Some would say, is that it was the trying to think, Roger. I guess is that just that simple of an answer, and how America radically changed. Whereas we were 100% isolationist before World War II, we were 100% internationalist after World War II, which led to the development of the United Nations and the Marshall Plan. And there was a Republican congressman who was drunk on internationalism, who wanted a press in the United States to print books, school books for all the children of the world, forgetting about local custom, local economics, local politics, local culture. And the same school book would be read by children in America as were read in Saudi Arabia, which is, of course, nonsense. It didn't go anyplace. But it tells you about how far we were tilting toward internationalism, including, silly stuff.
So does it surprise you now, or what's your perspective? Because in the years since World War II, the construct that was built by Truman and the presidents and the Congresses after, that world order, which was to the benefit of the United States. It was built on our system, free market economics, political freedom.
Right.
Of course, that's under assault today, Craig, as we're having this discussion about April 1945. We're in the cusp of April 2022, and Russia has invaded Ukraine. It's naked aggression, targeting civilians. Analysts, you don't have to be a sophisticated intellectual, can see that the construct that was created in Europe after the Second World War is under assault.
Yes.
What's your take on that as a historian, Craig?
Is that Santayana was right, is that those who fail to study history are doomed to repeat it. But also that Twain was right, is that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does often shadow itself. I'm paraphrasing here. But and that's why it's important to study history, is that because for a lot of reasons, including that it's just fun, is that but we see the sick men of Europe. We used to talk about the sick men of Europe, and it used to be Germany or France or another, other countries like that, especially in the 19th century. So now the sick man of Europe right now apparently is Ukraine because of Russian aggression. And I've been asked several times about the similarities, and obviously Putin stripping out portions of Ukraine are reminiscent of Hitler stripping out portions of Czechoslovakia, because he said they were more Germanic than in nature than they were Czech in nature. And also American public opinion, that no president can lead us into war without unified public opinion. And we were ambivalent before September 7th. And from looking at the polling data, it seems like we're ambivalent now, not about aiding them with humanitarian aid, but certainly about sending in U.S. troops. So those are two similarities.
Yeah. What about something that you were just commenting on, the mindset of isolationism, which really was almost bipartisan. It was stronger in Republican camps pre-World War II, pre-Pearl Harbor. And then the end of the war in 1945, and you were just giving us these examples of, robust internationalism. Today, the United States and within the Democratic Party and Republican Party, there are strong neo-isolationist voices.
Yes.
Are you worried that the balance is tilting towards the neo-isolationist?
No.
Or no. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Roger. I interrupt you. Please finish.
I was going to say that. Are you worried about that balance tilting, or is the rise of autocrats like Putin and Xi in China really the kind of almost prudent reminder, and that this is not neo-isolation?
We'll never go back. We'll never go back to being all isolationists. We might tilt a little bit isolationist, and then other years tilt a little more internationalist. But I think at the hyperspeed flow of information and the movement of people between countries prevents us from ever becoming isolationists again. We're not homogeneous the way we were, in 1941. In 1941, we all read the same newspaper, listened to the same radio, ate the same breakfast cereal. We were pretty much a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country in 1941. We're much more diverse now than we were then. So that makes us more internationalist. But in the 1930s, is that both parties were isolationists. One of the biggest leaders of the isolationist movement was Democratic Senator Burton K. Wheeler of Montana, who was a thorn in the side of the FDR administration. He was a Democrat, and he was very isolationist. He accused FDR of wanting to, dig trenches for American GIs to die in the war.
No, you read about Senator Wheeler throughout. Let's wrap this up. Great conversation with Craig Shirley, Reagan historian, author of April 1945, The Hinge of History, fascinating book. I got to ask you this for the Reaganism podcast. Here you are, you're studying World War II, studying this pivotal moment towards the end of the war. Of course, you wrote a book December 1941. So you spent a lot of time looking at FDR. How has your work on FDR and studying FDR shaped in any way your thinking about Reagan? Of course, we referenced before how Reagan was a huge supporter and voted for FDR 4 times. But did it give you an additional perspective or change your perspective at all, given all the work you've done on Ronald Reagan?
Yes, it does, Roger. Is that, we all know Reagan was the eternal optimist, and he had a wellspring of optimism springing up inside him. And I think part of it he got from Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal was a failure. And FDR admitted it was a failure. And the proof was in the pudding. Unemployment in 1939 was the same as it had been in 1932. But he gave the American people hope. And I think that's the most important residue of the New Deal, was that he gave the American people hope. And I think Reagan took that to heart. He didn't subscribe to FDR's economics or government policies, but he did subscribe to his optimism, which is very, very important, I think, for the American people, because an optimistic people are productive people. And a productive people create things like armaments to armed indigenous countries, or a strong economy to fight the Soviet Union. Is that, and so he got that from Franklin Roosevelt.
Craig Shirley, thank you so much for coming back on the show. Congratulations on all your success. April 1945, the Hinge of History.
Thank you, Roger, very, very much.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.